the person you need to be applauding is up next. And my job is just to introduce him. But to say this year marks the 25th anniversary of the Chapel of the Apostles. It was dedicated in the fall of the year 2000. Most days it's hard to think that that much time has passed. Occasionally when it rains, sacristans and ex-sacristans know that then we are reminded that maybe some of that time has passed because the skylights just will leak ever so slightly. But there's a good reason for that. The architect who designed the chapel was a disciple of an architect who was also a disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright. Every building that Frank Lloyd Wright, at least in lore, every building that Frank Lloyd Wright built leaked. So it's like the apostolic tradition, except of architecture. But those little moments aside, the Chapel of the Apostles has been the spiritual home, and I don't know what I did that just blacked out the screen. We're going to trust that Margaret can fix it, and I'm going to stand over here. For 25 years, the Chapel of the Apostles has been the spiritual home of the School of Theology. And that was especially underscored for us during the 20 months when we were outside of Hamilton Hall and in swing space. And the one place where the community actually came together as whole for those 20 months was the chapel. And that influence, that experience has stayed with us since then. It remains the place where the community gathers. So to commemorate this 25th anniversary of the chapel, we've asked the Reverend John Runkle to speak about the seminary chapels in Sewanee. John is a true polymath, both a wise and experienced priest of the church and an architect. He's an alum of the School of Theology, class of 1999, and also an alum of the University of Tennessee School of Architecture, go Vols, class of 1984. Clearly not an SEC crowd here. He practiced as an architect for many years, then discerned a call to the priesthood. Ordained in 1999, he served churches in Virginia and North Carolina, and served as the cathedral conservator at the Washington National Cathedral. He's best known locally for serving as the executive director of the St. Mary's Center, and then as vicar of St. James Midway. Please welcome John Runkle.
Thank you, Dean Terrell. I appreciate that glorious introduction. Glad to be here with you all today and to stand in this what once was a familiar spot for those of us who were in the School of Theology back in the 90s when this was known as the Pit. And so to be back here and to be speaking with you all today is really a treat. So thank you for having me. I was first introduced to the Chapel of the Apostles in August of 1996, well before the chapel was ever built. My family and I had recently moved to Sewanee so that I could attend the School of Theology. A few days before classes began, I was in Hamilton Hall picking up our mail and wandering the halls, learning the layout of things yet to come. While on the lower level of Hamilton Hall, I bumped into Marion Hatchett, former professor of liturgy and of blessed memory, and I introduced myself. He said, "Oh, you're the architect. Come into my office for a moment." And so, not knowing what like to expect, I followed him. And there he unrolled a set of architectural drawings and asked, "Isn't this the most hideous chapel you've ever seen?" Well, being a new student, I didn't want to say something that would haunt me for the next 3 years, so I answered, "Professor Hatchett, one thing I learned as an architect is not to criticize a design when I don't know the circumstances that led to the decisions." And so with that, I quickly scurried out of his office. And I breathed a sigh of relief. Then the next day, I was in Hamilton Hall once again, picking up our mail. But this time I decided not to walk past Professor Hatchett's office. Instead, I climbed to the first floor where, turning a corner, I suddenly bumped into Guy Lytle, former dean of the School of Theology and also of blessed memory. Dean Lytle said, "John, come into my office for a moment." There he unrolled the same set of architectural drawings and said, "Isn't this the most beautiful chapel?" Well, these were two lessons I learned before classes even started. One is to remember that there's at least two sides to every story, and two, to be damn careful what you do with church buildings and furnishing, because people have deep emotional attachments to them for many different reasons. So now, here I am, nearly 30 years after first being asked what I think of Chapel of the Apostles. I am once again on the spot to give an answer about the chapel on this occasion of the 25th anniversary. And as I looked back, as I said to Professor Hatchett back in 1996, I can't properly critique it until I know the circumstances leading to its construction. Hence, this brief overview of the different chapels that have served the School of Theology since its inception, culminating in the current Chapel of the Apostles. Don Armentrout, another former professor here at the School of Theology, the professor of church history, and once again of blessed memory, wrote in his book, The Quest for the Informed Priest, precisely when the School of Theology began as a distinct operation is difficult to determine. He then described several scenarios when the date could be 1876, 77, 78, or 79. In the end, he settled on the date of August 5th, 1878, which was when the first dean of the School of Theology, Reverend Telfair Hodgson, had accepted this new position. There is Dean Hodgson. However, I must respectfully disagree with Professor Armentrout and contend that the spirit of the School of Theology was established in 1866, 12 years earlier, when Bishop Charles Quintard, second bishop of the Diocese of Tennessee, along with three other gentlemen, returned to the mountain following the Civil War to reestablish the university. On March 22nd, Bishop Quintard chose the location of two buildings that would establish the identity of the University of the South. One would be a diocesan training school for clergy. Second would be the location of a chapel. Bishop Quintard chose the location of the chapel on an area of prominent high ground, originally identified in 1860 by Bishop John Henry Hopkins, the first bishop of Vermont, who was invited to come to this mountain, assess the lay of the land, and develop a master plan for the future university. And what you see on the screen in front of you is the Hopkins map. And so why was this particular location important? Because historically, prominent public buildings often were located on high ground for aesthetic and symbolic reasons. You see, human beings like to put important things up on pedestals so that they can be admired and respected. It's a place of honor. It's the same reason that the university chose a high point for its first proposed building, the cornerstone of which was laid in October 1860, but not completed due to the war. This new chapel would be located approximately 1,000 feet from the site of the cornerstone, but still at the same elevation above sea level. And while the cornerstone ceremony was witnessed by large crowds and great fanfare, this second attempt to restart the university was much smaller and more subdued. A humble new beginning. Those in attendance that day only included Bishop Quintard, his 3 associates, several local mountain folk, and a number of workmen of color. At the chosen location, the workmen built and raised a rustic wooden cross 12 feet in height. And as the sun was setting that day, this small group gathered around the cross to pray God's consecration of the ground where it stood and blessings on the subsequent efforts to reestablish the university. No photos exist of this event, but the painting on the screen is from 1958 and is conjectural in its composition, but still gives us an impression of what took place that evening. As simple and understated as this event may seem today, the act of raising a cross back then represented a dramatic shift in the sensibilities of the Episcopal Church in this part of the country. You see, prior to the Civil War, several bishops who were influential in the formation of the university, including James Odie, the first bishop of Tennessee, Leonidas Polk, the first bishop of Louisiana, and Stephen Elliott, the first bishop of Georgia, could be characterized as evangelicals, meaning they strongly believed in the priority of God's word and the sermon being the focal point of worship. Sola scriptura, in other words. Bishop Quintard, on the other hand, was a self-professed ritualist, a growing trend in the last half of the 19th century that subscribed to the notions put forth by the Cambridge Camden Society, or what would become known as the Ecclesiological Society. Items such as vestments, processions, crosses, and candles on the altar, making the sign of the cross, east-facing altars, the use of incense, many things that are commonplace in today's church were scorned by the evangelicals at that time. In fact, ritualism was so controversial that its opponents referred to it and accused its practitioners of popery, a pejorative term alluding to practices of the Roman Church that Protestants sought to discredit. For example, Bishop Odie in his life was known to have refused to consecrate a new church because it displayed crosses on the exterior of the building, and the altar had a cross and 2 candles on it. So, needless to say, he would not have approved of a 12-foot high cross being raised to signal the university's new beginning had he still been alive. Nevertheless, the rituals that took place that day would give shape to the piety of the School of Theology going forward. The rustic cross and the consecrated ground surrounding it would mark the exact location where the first seminary chapel would be built, even though construction would not begin for another 10 years in 1876. Even so, the influence of ritualism would not be forgotten. The first chapel, or as it was more commonly known as the oratory, was a room on the north end of the first floor of St. Luke's Hall. And the image you see on the screen in front of you is a rendering of what the St. Luke's Hall was first displayed to be, but then soon thereafter, a second rendering was done. And so hopefully you can tell the difference between the first and the second. And if you can't, I'll help you out, that the windows on the far left side of the drawing now have lancet heads to the windows rather than square headings. And that was where the new chapel would be located. The oratory was oriented so the altar and worshipers would face east, the direction from which tradition taught Christ will make his second coming. Another ancient practice reclaimed by the ritualists. In fact, all of the university's early chapels were oriented to the east as well. The architect of St. Luke's Hall was Henry Hudson Holly, an accomplished New York architect with a national reputation. Unfortunately, I was unable to find a photo of Mr. Holly, but still, he had an earlier precedent on this campus when he designed the Hodgson Library, completed in 1877, which is the university's first stone building located at the west end of South Carolina Avenue and now known as Hodgson Hall. It's not clear if Mr. Holly was a devoted Christian or not, but he did publish a book on church architecture in 1871 that still is in print today. In 1876, Bishop Quintard received a gift of $25,000 to build St. Luke's Hall from Charlotte Manigault of Brighton, England, an expatriate from South Carolina. The value of her gift equates to approximately $775,000 today. She also can be credited with giving the building the name of St. Luke's in honor of Bishop Quintard's previous profession as a physician. The cornerstone was laid on October 18th, 1876, St. Luke's Day, by Bishop William Mercer Green, first Bishop of Mississippi, and assisted by Bishop Quintard. 2 years later, on October 18th, 1878, once the building was completed, the oratory was consecrated by the same two bishops. In this photo, one can see the worship space, the shape of the oratory as it was designed in the Gothic Revival style, with a barrel vaulted ceiling and exposed wooden arches that gives the room a greater sense of spaciousness in spite of its small size. The east-facing altar is adorned with an altar cross, candlesticks, and small docile curtain above. We can hear Bishop Odie rolling over in his grave. It sits on a platform consisting of 4 steps to reach altar level. In addition, there is a freestanding ambo and fixed collegiate-style seats flanking both sides of the center aisle. A portion of the wall above the altar and around each lancet window are painted stencil patterns indicative of the late 19th century Gothic Revival style. The stained glass windows were designed by Henry E. Sharp and Sons, New York, who also happens to have windows in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so he's no slouch. The 3 windows depict the crucifixion scene, but only those with sharp eyes will recognize that the Virgin Mary is on the right and St. John on the left, which is, of course, the reverse of their traditional arrangement. As I mentioned, the oratory is not a large space, only a seating capacity of 30 people. But keep in mind that in 1878, the School of Theology consisted of only 8 students and 3 faculty. As the years passed and enrollment grew, change to the oratory was inevitable. For example, in 1894, an article in the Swanee Times recorded the new dean at that time, who was William Porcher de Bose, explaining that slight changes recently were made to the oratory to accommodate more students as well as visitors and make the space conform better to cathedral-style worship, which means chants, music, and formality in worship, rather than parish style, where the liturgy is simply spoken. Since this was what most all seminarians knew at that time. So obviously, the influence of ritualism continued to hold sway. After 30 years, on April 22nd, 1908, the School of Theology moved its worship from the oratory to the recently completed St. Luke's Chapel, and the former worship space was converted into a library and reading room. Even though the furnishings and the stained glass windows were removed, Dean de Bose said he felt the act opening a library was not a deconsecration of the beloved oratory, but really a reconsecration of the sacred spot to the larger needs of a growing department. However, since then, St. Luke's Hall has been remodeled several times, along with the former oratory, which now is a seminar room. That's the space today. If the oratory was ever deconsecrated, I'm yet to find that fact. In 1893, Telfair Hodgson, the first dean of the School of Theology, as well as former vice chancellor of the university, died from a heart attack at the age of 53. 10 years later, in 1903, Frances Glenn Potter Hodgson, the dean's widow, informed the board of trustees that she wanted to construct a new chapel for the theological department as a memorial to her late husband. On June 22nd, 1904, Bishop Thomas Gaylor, third Bishop of Tennessee, conducted the ceremony for the laying of the cornerstone of the Hodgson Memorial Chapel. By June 1907, 3 years later, the chapel was completed at the cost of $24,150.79, which equates to approximately $830,000 today. On June 11th, 1907, the first service was held in the new chapel. However, 2 days later, June 13th, 1907, Frances Glenn Hodgson died. In the same year, on September 11th, 1907, the 14th anniversary of Dean Hodgson's death, the Memorial Chapel of St. Luke was consecrated by Bishop Garrett. The chapel was built immediately to the south of St. Luke's Hall at approximately the same elevation and oriented to the east as well. The architect of the chapel was Charles Coolidge Haight, another prominent New York architect. And I just had to share his photo because if that's not a dapper looking architect, I don't know what that is. It was written of him that Haight enjoyed a social and professional status within Episcopalian circles unmatched by any other architect. His father, the Reverend Dr. Benjamin I. Haight, was a well-known priest in New York, serving at Trinity Wall Street, St. Peter's, Chelsea, and as a professor at General Seminary. What's more, he was the first custodian of the Book of Common Prayer in 1868. So it's safe to say that Charles Haight was well versed with the liturgy and traditions of the church at that time. He was known for designing several buildings on the Yale University campus, as well as developing the campus master plan for General Seminary, along with several buildings on that campus, including their Chapel of the Good Shepherd that was consecrated in 1888. He also designed several churches throughout the eastern United States. Again, it was written, Haight was a special advocate of the English Gothic revival movement, which he used and adapted to collegiate and ecclesiological architecture. St. Luke's Chapel is a sophisticated example of this style in the early 20th century, one of the most admired stone buildings on campus. The new chapel was larger than the oratory, more than 3 times the size, with a seating capacity of 100. Like the oratory and other 20th century worship spaces, St. Luke's Chapel continued the ritualist traditions. It's a rectangular space oriented to the east, with the altar positioned at that end of the space on a 5-step raised platform. Above and on both sides of the altar is a carved oak reredos containing paintings of the 12 apostles with the crucified Christ in the middle. If you haven't had an opportunity to go into the chapel, I recommend that you do. But in the meantime, here are photos showing the apostles that are on both sides of the crucified Christ that is in the middle. The paintings were made by Johann Ortel, an accomplished painter, wood carver, as well as an Episcopal priest who lived in Swanee from 1886 to 1889. After leaving Swanee and until his death in 1909, Father Ortel created a prodigious number of paintings that ultimately he and his son bequeathed a large portion of to this university. These paintings in the reredos were completed in 1908, a year after the building was completed, but in 1 year prior to Father Ortel's death. But they hung in Convocation Hall until 1923, when they were installed in this carved wooden reredos, along with a new wooden altar as a memorial to Francis Glenn Hodgson. The roof structure of the chapel is a character-defining feature consisting of a series of exposed heavy timber king post trusses that continued the tradition of remarkable carpentry found in medieval English parish church buildings. Above the altar, there are 3 stained glass windows that were installed many years later in 1957 to honor Edmund P. Dandridge, former dean of the School of Theology and Bishop of Tennessee. The windows were designed and fabricated by R. Geisler Incorporated of New York, a well-established and respected ecclesiological company that still is in existence today. The windows depict the risen Christ in the middle, St. Luke on the right, and a modern theological student on the left. If you can see it closely enough, you'll notice that young fellow with the Morse board on his head and holding his prayer book close to his heart. As in the oratory, there was a freestanding ambo, fixed collegiate style seats flanking both sides of the center aisle. In addition, there was a carved wooden screen at the west end of the fixed seats with a cross mounted on the top beam. Originally, the screen was intended to separate seating for the clergy and seminarians from the lay visitors. Other notable elements in the space included an organ given once again by the Hodgson family in 1911. Then on April 29th, 1931, the senior class of the seminary gave a baptismal font hewn from Swanee stone. As the 20th century progressed, ritualism in the life of the church began to wane as the liturgical movement gained momentum. As many of you know, the liturgical movement sought to reverse the medieval liturgical practices that ritualism reintroduced in the last century by re-emphasizing the centrality of the Eucharist and the active participation of the laity in common worship. This shift proved challenging for worship spaces built according to ritualistic practices, particularly regarding the altar and its location. The liturgical movement advocated for the altar to be pulled out from the liturgical east wall so that the celebrant can lead the liturgy from behind the altar facing the congregation. In this photo taken later on in the 60s, I believe it was, if not the 70s, one can see that the altar is now free standing. The top two steps of the altar platform have been removed and making it more accessible to the worshiping congregation. Another issue that caused concern in St. Luke's Chapel at that point in time was the fixed collegiate style seating. While the fixed seats certainly were reminiscent of the ancient collegiate chapels of Oxford and Cambridge, they were not conducive for seminarians coming to Sewanee with families in the latter part of the 20th century. Some modifications were made to the wooden stalls and additional chairs were brought inside the screened area, while some seminarians chose to sit with their families on the west side of the screen, but at the end, not a satisfactory solution. Still, over the years, St. Luke's Chapel hosted a great many clerical dignitaries from across the Anglican Communion, including folks from Salisbury, Puerto Rico, Liberia, Panama, Haiti, Hong Kong, London, Suffolk, England, and Japan. Likewise, numerous ordinations took place there. One historic event in particular happened on October the 10th, 1952, when the chapel hosted the chancellor, vice chancellor, regent, trustees, the seminary dean, and faculty for discussion and debate regarding the issue of whether African Americans should or should not be admitted into the School of Theology. It was recorded in the service register that the dean and faculty took the stand that, quote, segregation in a theological school is untenable to Christian principles, and it cannot be tolerated in a Christian society, not to mention a theological seminary. Unfortunately, the Board of Trustees decided otherwise, which resulted in the resignation of several faculty members, the dean, and the chaplain. Next year, in 1953, the trustees changed their stance, and the first African-American student, Merritt Collier, was admitted to the School of Theology. Women, on the other hand, were not admitted into the D-Min program until 1971, when Julia May Mauney was being the first female seminarian. By the early 1980s, changes were happening to the Episcopal institutions on the mountain. In 1981, the Sewanee Academy, formerly the Sewanee Military Academy, merged with St. Andrew's School and relocated to their campus, thus freeing up their former buildings and campus on Tennessee Avenue for the university's use. In the fall of 1984, the School of Theology had moved from St. Luke's Hall to Hamilton Hall on the former SMA campus. However, there was no chapel conveniently located to the building, and it was impractical to expect seminarians and faculty to trek back and forth to St. Luke's Chapel several times each day for worship. At the time, the university estimated that a new chapel would cost $500,000, and soon thereafter, Mr. and Ms. Paul Howell of Houston made a gift of $750,000 toward its construction. Still, an architect would need to be found and an acceptable design created, all of which would take until 1996. In the meantime, the School of Theology made use of Hargrove Auditorium in Hamilton Hall as a stopgap chapel. Hargrove Auditorium, as you can experience, was a two-story, nondescript, cylindrical-shaped lecture hall with amphitheater-style seating that could accommodate 84 people. Obviously, the space originally was not designed to serve as a chapel. It just didn't have the feel of a space where prayer had been valid, it seemed. Still, despite its limitations, the pit, as it was affectionately known, did a reasonable job accommodating worship according to the tenets of the liturgical movement. A freestanding altar table, an ambo, as well as seating for the liturgical ministers, all on the lower floor, was set in the midst of the surrounding congregation. The steep incline of the amphitheater seating posed the greatest challenge to preachers, as they found themselves having to look up from their text and share the good news with the kneecaps of the congregation. In spite of its limited architectural splendor, the pit did host several clerical dignitaries over the years, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, in 1999. In total, the School of Theology used the pit as its chapel for 16 years before moving to the Chapel of the Apostles in the year 2000. Serious work on the design of the new chapel didn't begin until 1991, when Vice Chancellor Sam Williamson appointed an advisory committee to lead the effort. In 1993, the university's Board of Regents commissioned Fay Jones and Maurice Jennings as the architects to develop a design for the new chapel. Mr. Jones, an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright, had received national attention and awards for his 1980 design of Thorn Crown Chapel, which you see on the screen in front of you. Thorn Crown Chapel, a non-denominational meditation chapel built on a remote wooded site outside Eureka Springs, Arkansas. He also received accolades, that's another one from inside of Thorn Crown Chapel. But Mr. Jones also received accolades for the Mildred B. Cooper Memorial Chapel that was built in 1988 in Bella Vista, Arkansas. That also had a similar interior. Once again, it's a non-denominational chapel intended to host weddings and private meditation, yet neither chapel had any church affiliation. So we can see from these few slides a distinct style inherent in Mr. Jones' chapels. Tall buildings that reinterpret Gothic structural elements using contemporary framing along with natural materials and lots of glass. On October 10th, 1995, the ground on which the Chapel of the Apostles would be built was dedicated. And then on May 2nd, 1977, the groundbreaking ceremony took place. Now, please note that a cornerstone was not laid for this chapel, as was the practice for previous chapels, because since the mid-20th century, that tradition had become passé in the architectural world. Construction on the chapel would begin in the spring of 1999 and was completed in 2000. So the School of Theology could have its first service in the space on October 22nd that year. On October 11, 2000, the chapel was consecrated by Don Wimberly, Bishop of Texas and Chancellor of the university. The chapel consists of a baptistry space at the entrance and beyond the nave. A sacristy, lady chapel, and reconciliation space are located under the organ loft that separates the baptistry and nave. The building is oriented to be parallel with Hamilton Hall rather than due east like the chapels of the past. The shape of the building is characterized by its massive gabled roof with skylights that can extend almost the entire length of the ridge. The structural framing consists of an innovative arrangement and interpretation of Gothic structural elements that appear as delicate network of interlocking tracery. Large amounts of glass, clear glass, fill the spaces between the vertical structural elements except on both sides of the organ loft. The stone floor throughout is on one level, except at the liturgical east end of the nave, where there is a three-step platform. The altar, ambo, and seating are all movable furniture, with the baptismal font located, obviously, in the baptistry. Even though the seats are not fixed in place, the design of the interior is oriented around an implied center aisle. The photo on the screen that you see is a photo taken by the architect soon after the building was completed, so that you can see the arrangement of the center aisle with the chairs facing in that easterly, liturgical easterly direction. The altar, there's a plain, empty cross at the far end, seats for the liturgical ministers, as well as the baptismal font at this end. As designed, the chapel can accommodate 250 worshipers, and it is but the largest seminary chapel to date by far. As I mentioned earlier, numerous donors made possible the construction of Chapel of the Apostles, including the Howells of Houston, the Mills of Chattanooga, and hundreds of others. St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Chattanooga made a substantial gift toward the new organ that was installed in 2004. In total, the cost of construction, including design fees, furnishings, and the organ, equaled $4.6 million. Since its completion, additional elements have been added, including an exterior cross honoring the Reverend Maurice Goldsmith in 2001, an exterior bell honoring Bishop Bertram Herlong in 2004. The nave, in the nave, a wooden altar platform was added prior to 2010 to bring the altar lower and closer to the congregation. And the original ambo was replaced with a new design. Originally, an empty wooden cross was positioned at the liturgical east end. Soon thereafter, the corpus of the crucified Christ was added to it. In March 2022, a new crucifix was commissioned for the nave to reflect a more universal depiction of Christ. Since its completion, the Chapel of the Apostles received design awards in 2003 and 2004 from various architectural organizations. As with the other seminary chapels, Chapel of the Apostles has welcomed numerous clerical dignitaries from across the Anglican Communion, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu in 2008 and Archbishop Rowan Williams in 2016. As I alluded to in my opening comments, the design of Chapel of the Apostles caused sharp disagreement among the seminary faculty and folks in the Swanee community. Putting aside personalities of individuals from that time, let me attempt an objective explanation. We're going back quite a ways. In the 1st century BC, Roman architect Vitruvius proclaimed that good architecture must contain 3 characteristics to be successful. characteristics that still remain relevant to the present day. And they are firmness, commodity, and delight. Firmness means a building must have the structural integrity in order to stand up, support itself, and to resist any external forces acting upon it. Commodity means the design of a building should not only accommodate the practical functions it contains, the activities that need to go on there, but also to enliven them. Finally, delight means the building should be attractive and inspiring to people when they see it and interact with it. In other words, a successful design should make a lasting impression on the individual and the larger community. Chapel of the Apostles certainly satisfies the characteristic of firmness, since the building continues to stand after 25 years and shows no sign of collapse, I think. Likewise, it seems to satisfy the characteristic of delight, since most people have an emotional reaction to the design, either positive or negative. However, the success of the building seems to fall somewhat short when it comes to commodity, its ability to accommodate and support the liturgies of the 21st century seminary. Sure, it provides a container in which the community can gather and be sheltered from the elements, but critics felt the design of the chapel was backward-looking, reverting to the ritualist space for worship rather than looking forward, utilizing the principles more strongly of the liturgical movement. The narrow proportions of the building, the overabundance of glass, and the raised altar platform have a negative impact on today's worship. The narrowness of the nave doesn't allow much opportunity for flexible worship configurations. The amount of glass is challenging to worshipers trying to focus attention on the task at hand, which is the liturgy. What's more, large amounts of glass are detrimental to the acoustics of a space for both music and the spoken word. And a raised fixed three-step platform not only is a hindrance to flexible liturgical configurations, but it is an obstacle for accessibility to those with mobility concerns. Consequently, modifications to the interior have been made in an effort to resolve some of these issues, such as the installation of the one-step wooden platform, positioning of a new ambo at the west end of the nave, and arranging the chairs in collegiate fashion. Now, please don't think I am suggesting that the Chapel of the Apostles is a failure, because it's not. There's no such thing as a perfectly designed worship space. I'm critiquing the chapel as a church architect, as well as a priest, being as objective as I can. Truly, the experience of 25 years of seminarians, faculty, and visitors who have worshiped in this space cannot be discredited or diminished. The presence and the action of God in worship doesn't depend on the quality of the architectural container. Still, our seminary chapels are more than simply stone, wood, and glass. I once had a colleague who also was a historical architect who asked me once, "Why are you so interested in church buildings? They're just boxes." Well, obviously, my colleague was not a believer. For whatever reasons, he was ignorant of the power of God's presence and action in such places, to the reality that church buildings do matter. When you and I came to seminary, we brought with us the particularities of the churches and congregations that inspired and shaped our piety. Then, once here, we were thrown together with other seminarians who brought their own particularities, not to mention those of the faculty and of the institution. And we were challenged to discern and adapt. The crucible of the chapel and the classroom transfigured us, hopefully for the better. Then you and I were sent into the world to serve and lead other churches and congregations, other crucibles more challenging than before. Some of the formation we took from here was valuable, while some we left behind because we felt God's call to do things differently. For more than 147 years, the chapels of the School of Theology have shaped the spiritual and liturgical lives of those who worshiped here and then went on to serve God in other capacities. Bishop Quintard was intentional in raising that cross so many years ago, even though the first chapel was 10 years in becoming reality. He had faith and confidence that cross would bear good fruit in the generations to come. And since then, the daily work of God, the Opus Dei, has played out in these chapels, making them holy spaces, along with those who passed through their doors, making them holy as well. Thank you. Happy to take any questions if you have any. And I know that there is evensong that's going to be beginning at Chapel of the Apostles. Jamie.
John, didn't Marion have his own plan?
Well, that's interesting you brought that up. Interesting you brought that up. Because I have searched high and low.
Yeah.
And the archives has searched high and low. I've talked to a lot of people who I would have thought knew that there was something, but we can't find it.
It was in the round.
Well, I heard somebody said it looked like a Kwanzaa. But I never saw it, but I'd heard, but nobody seems to remember that anywhere it is today. So, yeah.
It kind of had a pagoda ceiling too, not just a Quonset hut, it's had a part in the middle that's raised up.
We can't seem to find it because I'd love to see it. Love to see it.
I was on the committee. I know it existed.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well then you can help track it down.
Whether I still got documents in a box somewhere.
Okay,
Maybe when I'm not. Yeah.
please do. Please do. Yeah, I talked to Jerry Smith. He didn't remember it. No indication in the Board of Regents agendas. So
I would give it to conspiracy.
okay. Others? Well, that's great. Thanks very much. Oh, I'm sorry.
The original windows and the oratory were taken out, and where they might be.
That's another good question. They were taken out, I believe it was 1909 when the space was converted to a library study center, but we have no indication of where they went, which, that's a shame, but we can't find it. As of yet, we haven't found it.
The AMBO is in the new oratory. That AMBO is in the new oratory theater campus hall.
Oh, okay, great, great. That's the other thing that I've enjoyed in this search is seeing how pieces of furniture move from one place to the other. So, yes, Bob.
When I was here, in 62, 65, the oratory was the oratory. So it went back to that, at least for during our period of time. Not it, it was still on legs.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't worship it, but it was used as a homiletic, chapel.
Oh, great. Okay, because I found photos that looked like folks standing at an ambo preaching or doing something, but everything else, the other accoutrements weren't in place. So, yeah, interesting lifespan. Yes, Rob.
This is more of an emotional question. I mean, but, you know, looking at the contrast from St. Luke's to the pit as it was, I mean, must have been an incredibly jarring experience for the community to move from one worship space to another with such a stark contrast. I mean, so I don't know if anybody here remembers that time or can speak to that, but I mean, obviously they were making the best of a very difficult situation, but is there much record of, I can just imagine weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Right.
I mean, so how do people react to moving from St. Luke's to the pit as a choice?
The best I've been able to find, and I've only been able to talk with a few people who went through that experience. And like most things in the church, some people welcomed it and some people were in deep misery about it. So, some felt like moving into Hamilton Hall was a definite improvement over the conditions that they'd had before. And others were just downcast about the thought of leaving that space that had housed them for, close to 100 years. So.
Just to speak to that, for a few years when I was here in 91 and 94, a group of seminarians and sacristans and college choir members went in and cleaned St. Luke's Chapel. We spent a lot of hours. It was just in terrible condition. We cleaned it. We did what we could to get it back into useful condition as a worship space. For many years, some compliment was offered from Sunday through Thursday nights, and was a part of that. It was a wonderful college seminary collaboration. So it was reclaimed for a few years back in the 90s.
Yes.
Was the basement of the Cravens Hall used at one point as a chapel for seminary? I believe there was an altar and the stained glass window facing east in that downstairs area. Do you know anything about that time period?
I know that there was a chapel that was put there when SMA was still active.
That's it.
And then what happened to it at that point, I don't know. That's my next direction of research on other chapels on the Swanee Mountain.
The stained glass window from that chapel is now on the first floor of Quintard Hall, and you go in the main part. Stained glass window. Right.
Oh, great.
The altar's still there.
The altar's still there.
Yeah.
And the altar in St. Luke's Hall is still, or St. Luke's Chapel is still there. It's just been pulled over and pushed to the side. And due to time constraints, I didn't get into what has happened in St. Luke's Chapel since it's been renovated into a performance space, because some of the things, the fixed seating has been taken out, as well as the altar has been pulled to the side. The screen that was at the end of the west end of the fixed seating has now been moved to the west side of the entrance door. So it's still there, but it's been put in a different position. So some adjustments, some changes. Andy,
Just one other trivia point. Do you know the story of the inspiration for the baptismal font?
which one?
The copper baptismal font at Coda. And Swanee, the School of Theology used to take trips to England every summer for 2 weeks. Great pilgrimage, and I was on the trip in May and June of 2000. And we went to Norwich Cathedral, and there the baptismal font was the copper kettle that the candy makers of Norwich had used centuries before, and it had become the baptismal font of Norwich. And the group of seminarians and faculty who were on that trip said this could be a wonderful inspiration for the chapel of the apostles to be baptized upon. And it was the copper kettle was in the sort of candy makers from Norwich.
I mean,
By Norwich people.
That's one thing that reminded me. I've never found a definitive answer on how the name Chapel of the Apostles came to be. Every person I've asked, nobody knows. So that's a lingering mystery. Anyway, thank you very much. Well done. Thank you, sir. We'll do it. Yeah, sounds great.
Sorry about the food drinking.
I didn't know what it was.